The operating room doors slammed open. "Grandma, wait! I know why Dad's kidneys are failing." Every head turned. The syringe vanished from my arm. For a second, even the heart monitor seemed to hold its breath. My name is Eleanor, or Nora Pike, 60 years old, Detroit steel in my bones. 2 rooms away, my son Caleb was prepped to receive my kidney. I'd signed the papers. I'd told them I understood the risks. I thought duty was simple. A mother keeps her word. But duty gets complicated when a 10-year-old runs in with a cracked phone and a truth the adults were too polite or too scared to say. This started small. An unlabeled white bottle tucked behind prescriptions, a parking garage meeting on level P3, the words ARC, milestone, investors, and the kind of smile you wear when you're sure you can make pain look like progress. The anesthesiologist whispered, "Eleanor!" The surgeon leaned in. My grandson climbed onto the step and held up that old phone like evidence. He said, "Please, let them hear it." Here's what I learned under a light so bright, it showed me every line on my hands. Love doesn't always mean moving forward. Sometimes love is the courage to pause and ask the question that might save a life. If this were your family, would you keep the peace? Or would you press play? I had already signed the consent forms. I had already told the nurse I understood the risks. My son, Caleb, was in a room 2 doors down, waiting for the kidney I had promised to give him. I had told myself it was a mother's duty. And when you've spent your life in a city that builds things, engines and axles and people who keep their word, words like duty don't feel negotiable. A nurse said my name to keep me anchored while the anesthesiologist snapped on a cap. Another nurse rolled a stool against the tile with the soft patience of someone who has heard every kind of prayer. From where I lay, I could see a slice of the corridor through a rectangle of glass. My daughter-in-law stood on the other side, in a cream sweater, her arms crossed, a kind smile pinned to her face like a name tag that said professional. Her name is Sloan. She was joined by her parents, Vince and Colleen Mercer, the kind of couple who always look like they just left a fundraiser or are on their way to start one. Colleen wore pearls and lipstick you could see from the far end of a church aisle. Vince had the posture of a man who expected doors to open before he reached them. I tried to breathe through whatever it was I was feeling. Fear, probably, and shame for feeling fear when my son needed me to be brave. The anesthesiologist lifted a syringe and called my first name again. "Eleanor?" I nodded. The light felt hotter. The room felt farther from the ground. The door flew open. He was 10 and half wild from winter air and worry, cheeks flushed, hair sticking up where a hat had just missed it. His sneakers were wet, leaving little commas on the floor. My grandson, Max, clutched an old phone with a cracked screen to his chest. A nurse reached for him and missed. He stepped to my side like he'd been practicing it in his head all day. "Grandma," he said, "you have to wait. I have to tell them why Dad's kidneys are failing." Everything stopped. Even the part of my heart that had already started to give itself away stopped. A clamp made a tiny sound on a tray that carried all the echoes of everything I didn't want to imagine. Someone took the syringe away from my arm without making me feel like a coward. Before I tell you what happened next, I need to tell you about Detroit in winter and what duty can do to a person who doesn't ask enough questions until the questions hit her like a cold wind. I started at the plant when I was 23. I stayed until 60, though the last handful of years found me counting down the breaks like a kid counts down days to summer. The factory had its own weather, hot and metallic when the presses thundered, chilly and brittle when they stopped. The rhythm of the line gets in your bones and your sleep. The first time I watched raw steel become a fender and then part of a car that rolled past me on its own power, I felt something like pride. Not the kind that settles into your shoulders and keeps you from slouching. We made things that took families to Little League and to funerals, and to ocean water they'd never seen. You try not to think about the distance between those trips. I had 2 kids. Caleb came first, a hard squall of an infant that turned into a boy with too much energy to sit still and a softness for neighborhood strays. He loved football from the time he understood how to hold a ball. He liked being told what to do and liked telling other boys what to do even more. But the kind of way that made them listen because he was already in it with them. After college and a lot of afternoons helping at camps, he took the job as a high school coach at a school where the bleachers creaked and the lights flickered on like they were shaking off a nap. They loved him there. He took kids who'd never heard anyone say, "I see you," and made them run sprints until they saw themselves. The winter before everything broke, Caleb's color changed. It took me a while to notice because changes always start smaller than you think. He told me it was the season, that he used the weight room and he was fine. Then his ankles puffed a little. Then his headaches set in the base of his skull and rolled forward. Then he tasted pennies. I didn't sleep much that week. And one morning, after he called the school to tell them he'd be late, and I heard how thin his voice had gone, I told him we were going to urgent care. And urgent care told us to go to the ER, and the ER turned into a room with a curtain and a bag of clear liquid dripping like a metronome. Acute kidney injury, the doctor said, which sounded like something the air did to him instead of something anybody did on purpose. They kept him for observation, and then kept him for more than observation, and I found out that when you love someone, you can nap on a plastic chair like it's a feather bed. That's when Sloan started bringing green smoothies and planning apps and a binder with color-coded tabs. She is beautiful in the way that was designed rather than stumbled into. Hair the color of cereal milk, sweaters softer than any I own, and attention that feels like being gently held in place. She set up the supplements on a little rolling table next to the hospital bed. Plastic bottles like tiny castles, droppers with amber liquid that smelled like rain in a dandelion field. She handled conversations with insurance like she'd been born fluent in that particular cruelty. She brought in a nutritionist who made food taste like something other than paper. She said all the right things. A mother-in-law wants to believe her son chose wisely. A mother wants to believe the woman he chose loves him the way she loves him. That's half the story. And that was enough for me to fold my hands and say thank you when she handed me a cup of something chalky and told me it would help. What I didn't notice at first were the names that didn't match the prescriptions. I didn't notice an unlabeled white bottle tucked behind the ones with labels as crisp as new shirts. I didn't notice a schedule that was Sloan's, not the doctor's. What I noticed was that Caleb's laugh got smaller, and his naps got longer, and the nurse wrote down numbers that tightened my mouth even when I smiled. One afternoon, when the snow was coming down like sugar and the world out the window looked softer than it was, I picked up that unlabeled bottle and felt my stomach notice it before my eyes did. The pills inside were a blue that didn't seem fair. "What's this?" I asked. Sloane's face didn't change, not even a little. "Chelation support," she said, as if she were saying the name of a friend I had forgotten I liked. "All natural, doctor approved." I nodded like I knew what chelation support was. When Dr. Beasley rounded and adjusted his glasses and looked at Caleb's chart like it might apologize if he stared long enough, I asked him about the supplement. He frowned at the list. Not theatrical, just the way a person frowns when a piece is missing from the drawer where the forks go. "There is no such supplement on my orders," he said. The hallway felt longer on the walk back to Caleb's room.
I kept thinking about how many things are legal in America that can still take a person apart. We are a country that loves choice and also loves a sale. You can sell anything if you can convince enough people that it's their idea to buy it. I went home that night to my little place with the loud refrigerator and the porch light that buzzed and made my stoop look like an interrogation table. Max came over after school,
Wearing his backpack too low like he always did, letting it sway against the backs of his legs until it caught on the steps and he had to kick it free. He did his homework at my table and then drew a dragon that looked frightening, mostly because it had the kind of eyes that said it wasn't going to fall for your flattery. He didn't look up when he asked, "Grandma, can somebody make somebody else's kidneys tired on purpose?" The kettle whistled, and I took it off the heat like I was rescuing it from itself. I turned back, trying to keep my face from showing him the fear that had started to live just under the skin at my temples. "Why do you ask that, baby?" He still didn't look up. He ran the eraser along the page like he was petting a cat. "I heard Mom tell Grandpa Vince that once they have enough data, the study cashes out," he said. "She said after the transplant, they'll have the full arc." He looked up then and finally saw me listening with everything I had. "What's an arc, Grandma?" "Is it like a rainbow?" I smiled, because you do that to keep the room ordinary, and touched his cheek and said something about grown-up talk that kids don't need to worry about. After he left, I pressed a dish towel to my mouth and cried until my ribs ached, and then I made a list of the things I still had power over, and it only had 2 items. I could ask questions, and I could breathe. The transplant team called. They set a date. Sloan showed up at my door before the coffee maker finished its shuddering first sounds with a to-go cup and a pen that made my name look better than it usually does. "We're almost through this," she said, her voice like a blanket. "Sign where I flagged." "We don't have time," she added the way people do when they mean you don't have time to figure out you might have a choice. The night before I meant to sign the final consent, I pulled out the yellow lamp my mother left me and wrote a will like a person decades older than I am. I left Max my comic books in the shoebox in the hall closet, and my old ceramic pie dish because he likes the way it feels cool against his cheek when he's pretending to be wounded in battle. I asked Jesus to forgive the things I didn't know I didn't know. I asked my own mother to sit with me if she had any time left in heaven. When I finished, I closed my eyes and I could smell the factory floor and the stamped steel and the sweat and the way the foreman's coffee always smelled a little like burnt sugar. Duty wears a lot of colognes. Sometimes it smells like loyalty. And sometimes it smells like you haven't let yourself off the hook in 20 years. The next day, my nephew Evan knocked on my back door. He's 28, solid as a tool bench, and careful the way careful people are when they've seen too many corners turn too fast. He works on furnaces and water heaters and anything else that keeps the people on our block from freezing when Detroit decides to prove how far it can go. "Aunt Nora," he said, "you need to see this." He put his phone in my hand and fast-forwarded past a blur of concrete and cars to a frame that slowed and then sharpened enough that even my eyes could see it. The parking garage at St. Bridget Mercy, level P3. An hour with both hands close to each other near the bottom of the clock.
A man in a black cap approached. She handed him a padded envelope. He gave her a money clip and something small enough to look like nothing, unless you know what something looks like when it wants you to think it's nothing. A USB key. I tasted copper. I could hear my pulse in my wrists. "It could be anything," I said. because that's a thing a person says when they want it to be anything. Evan shook his head gently. I was servicing the unit on P3, he said. I wasn't trying to be in anybody's business. He pulled an earbud from his pocket that looked like it had been chewed by a raccoon. My mic picked up a little. I didn't mean it to. I still shouldn't have listened. He looked down at his boots, like the tile might arrest him. He pressed play. I heard the soft car park echo that makes everything sound like it's happening one hallway away. I heard a man say, RWE, first in human. I heard Sloan say, after the transplant, our arc of data is complete. I heard paper and the faintest laugh, like someone was proud of getting away with something small enough to practice. I didn't eat dinner. I folded a sandwich I didn't want in half and wrapped it up and put it in the fridge like I was going to want it later. I took the little white unlabeled bottle out of my purse, where I had tucked it with the care of a person carrying around her own heart. I rolled it in my hand until it warmed. I didn't open it. I called the transplant office and said my name into a voicemail 3 times and then hung up and called again. That night, Max knocked on my door with his backpack and a face that looked older than 10 in the way kids' faces look older when they know about grown-up things they shouldn't. He sat at my table, pulled an old phone from his hoodie, and set it down like he was offering me a leaf off a tree, even though he'd had to climb higher than he was tall to get it. He said, Mom said this phone is for old podcasts. I think it kept listening sometimes. He pressed a button on the side and then hit play with his thumb, like people in movies hit detonators. Voices filled my little kitchen. Sloane's voice is easy to recognize when you've been thanked by it enough times for bringing soup. Colleen's is like a teacher's who learned how to sweeten her disapproval. Vince's voice has money in it, even when he's not talking about it. Sloane said, once the numbers show decline and then post-transplant lift, the investors wire the milestone. Colleen said, and we're clear, this doesn't come back to us. Sloane said, it's a wellness study, off-platform. Everyone uses these supplements. Vince said, get the mother to sign. That's your job. Max had his chin tucked down like a little bird in a storm. He asked, did I do a bad thing? I folded his skinny hands inside mine and told him he did the bravest thing a person can do, which is tell the truth even when the truth feels like you're standing in the middle of the street and the parade is aimed at you. They wheeled me down a hallway that smelled like lemon cleaner and the kind of seriousness you can't inflate or deflate with a smile. Sloane walked beside me, her palms pressed together, her eyes on the papers a nurse held as if numbers were a kind of prayer she believed in more than God. She said, this is love. And maybe she believed that. Maybe she believed that money and proof were a kind of love if you held them tightly enough, and the right people told you that's what the future looks like. In a small room with a frosted glass window, Dr. Patel reviewed my labs. She's the kind of doctor who looks at your face while she's also looking at your numbers. Her hair was pulled back, and her earrings were small enough not to get in the way of anything. Your numbers look strong enough, she said. Any hesitation, we pause. Consent is not a one-time event. I wanted to tell her I had been taught my whole life that saying yes was a one-way door. I wanted to tell her I had cried on my mother's apron as a little girl because you don't tell people who depend on you that you can't, when you already said you would. I wanted to tell her that my hands smelled like decades of work, even when I used fancy soap. Before I could say any of that, Vince and Colleen walked in with volunteer badges and faces that looked like they were auditioning for calm. Doctor, Vince said, time is something Caleb doesn't have. Colleen put a hand on my shoulder like she was laying on a blessing and said, Nora knows what a mother's duty is. Dr. Patel's jaw shifted. Excuse us, she said to them. And then to me she said, we can and will pause for any concern. I signed the paper anyway.
Because a person is not the same as the lessons she remembers when she is carrying a lifetime of being good on her back, and her son is more precious than whatever shredded little doubts she still lets herself hold. They wheeled me into a room that looked like a stage and a chapel and a clean version of fear. Sloane stood outside the glass, her hands cupping her elbows like she was hugging herself, like she was keeping herself from falling apart. I watched her mouth move. I think she said, "Thank you." I think she said, "Finally." The light above me was both too bright and the only thing keeping me from feeling like I was going to sink through the floor. I closed my eyes to keep my courage from calling in sick at the last minute. I whispered my mother's name, and then the door blew open, and my grandson said the sentence that turned this story from obligation to something else entirely. "Grandma, you have to wait. I have to tell them why Dad's kidneys are failing." No one moved. Then, like the room had been in a freeze frame and someone hit play in the middle of the film, a nurse reached for my IV line and took away the syringe like you take away a match from a child who has been taught to admire fire. Max climbed up on the little step by the table and held the phone so even the doctor could see it. He pressed play. The words we had heard at my kitchen table filled the clean room. Sloane's voice saying ARC and Milestone and investors. Vince's voice asking if the mother could back out. Sloane saying she thinks it's love. Outside the glass, Sloane smacked it with the palm of her hand, and her face went hard in the way mirrors go hard when they reflect something you don't want to see. She said, "That's illegal. It's fake." Colleen tried to pull the door. Vince looked around for someone to be in charge besides Dr. Patel, and when he couldn't find that person, stared at the floor like it might do. Dr. Patel doesn't raise her voice to be heard. She lowers it until people lean in. Shut down the drugs. Call security. Get risk management.
No one comes in or out. I nodded, even though she hadn't asked me a question yet. She turned to me. "Eleanor, do you consent to pause?" "Yes," I said. "Please." It is a strange thing to say the word please when you are being returned to your own life. Security arrived with calm faces and shoes that didn't squeak. They moved Sloane and her parents to a small conference room, while a woman from compliance asked me if I felt safe to speak. She listened without looking at her watch. Evan texted me the video from the parking garage, and I watched it again on a screen that made the pixels look like they were trying to grow up, and I recognized something I had ignored my whole life. You can see almost anything if you let yourself name it as the thing it is. Sloane asked to come in and explain. Compliance told her no. She raised her voice in a way that made me think of polished floors at charity galas. "Real-world evidence is the future," she said, loud enough that we could hear her through the door. "People choose supplements every day. We are documenting outcomes. Investors pay for proof." I don't know if she believed the words or she was using them as a life raft. I do know people can convince themselves of almost anything if the right person tells them they're right and the money agrees. I sat up on the table and pulled the warmed blanket tighter around my shoulders, like it would keep out the cold that comes when you see the thing behind the thing. It wasn't a hospital conspiracy. It wasn't doctors lining their pockets. It was something trickier and therefore uglier. People who look like your neighbors using the language of wellness and freedom and choice to sell pain disguised as improvement. It was people who love results more than the people inside the data that bought them. They didn't roll me into surgery. They rolled me into a chair and then down to Caleb's room. He blinked when he saw me, and then he blinked again like I was the patient, and he didn't know how to ask if I was okay without making his questions about him, and he couldn't take that much anymore. "Mom," he said, his voice caught on a hook halfway to crying. "What happened?" I took his hand and told him the ugliest parts first, because that's how I've always told him the truth. He listened because he had to,
and then he let his head fall back on the pillow and closed his eyes. And I watched his throat work the way it did when he tried to swallow pain. "You almost let them take from you," he said. "It is a particular kind of anguish to watch your child apologize to you for something he didn't do." I kissed his forehead and said the line my own mother used on me when I felt like I'd burned down the city. "You're here," I said. "We can fix what's true." He nodded. The machine by his bed continued its soft counting. I held his hand and thought about how different the sound of a machine can be when you have hope sitting on your shoulder, even if it's a hope so small you have to squint to keep it from running away. In the days that followed, the hospital did what institutions do when they realize they might be standing in the middle of a mess they didn't make, but invited into their lobby by accident. They asked questions, they wrote down answers, they asked for the bottle I no longer had, and wrote down that I no longer had it, and put a little circle next to the line that said, "Obtain, if possible." They tested Caleb's blood for things they don't usually test for because they are not usually supposed to be there.
Helping him make jokes about being plugged into the wall like a phone that's charging, even as they watched his face for anything that made a joke not funny anymore. News is faster than healing. Within a week, local TV anchors tried out their serious faces to say, "Wellness data ring probed. Family members detained." Bloggers who love the word expose more than the word people wrote paragraphs about how rich folks can take a bowel cleanser and call it a cure if they have enough investors who think discomfort is a sign that something is working. Some articles got basic medical facts wrong. Some got the greed right. There were quotes from law enforcement that used words like ongoing investigation and alleged. There were quotes from a spokesperson for a company I had never heard of and I hope never to hear of again, who said their founders were committed to democratizing health and were shocked to hear their brand associated with the misuse of products by bad actors. I learned that bad actors do not have to be in movies. They live next to us. Sometimes they marry our sons. I would like to tell you I stopped shaking. I didn't. Not right away. I would like to tell you I slept. I didn't. Not really. I would like to tell you I forgave as quickly as church wants us to. I didn't. I wrote things on slips of paper and tore them up. I stood in the shower until the water went cold, and then I stood there some more just because I could do something a machine could not. I walked Detroit blocks with my scarf up over my mouth and watched the way winter makes smoke out of our breath and thought about how many ways we try to prove we are alive. Max drew me a picture of a lady with a cape and a boy with a phone that looked more like a chocolate bar, except for the little crack he drew near the top corner. He put stars in the corner like he wanted to give me something bigger than the kitchen ceiling. He wrote Grandma above the cape and made the letters too large and too small in the way kids do when their feelings arrive before their pen can keep up. He handed it to me and then threw himself into my lap so hard I had to catch him and the picture at the same time. "I'm sorry I took so long to tell you," he said into my shirt, "but I got there, right?" "You got there," I told him, and then I laughed while I cried because laughter and crying are both ways your body says, I am still a person who could make a noise. Evan took the old light fixture down in my kitchen and put up a new one that didn't buzz when it was tired. We sat at my table and ate pie with forks that were too small for pie because that was all I had clean, and I told him I was proud of his good carefulness, the kind that doesn't make a big deal about itself. He flicked the switch to the new light and said, "Bright's nice sometimes." And I nodded, and we both understood we weren't only talking about the light. Dr. Patel gave me a stack of pamphlets I didn't want about caretaker fatigue and the grief of being the strong one. She doesn't hand out pity, she hands out homework.
We'll manage Caleb with dialysis for now and medications that are actually medications, not a bottle someone's cousin's startup shipped in bulk. We will retest in a month and then again. Our job is to get to better. Your job is to rest enough that you remember what better looks like. I love her because she speaks like the line at the plant when it is in good rhythm, precise, on time, more interested in truth than volume.
Caleb's boys left a stack of cards on his nightstand. A few of them had real sentences. Most of them had drawings of footballs with arms. One card, from a freshman who had never learned how to gauge his own strength, wrote, "You're the best." It was, in fact, the best. Another card just said, "We need you, coach." And there is something that happens to a man when the kid he used to be tells him it is okay to be needed back. He smiled like someone loosened a knot somewhere you couldn't see. Sloane's arraignment was on a day when snow came down like a person being extra careful with powdered sugar. I did not go. I read 2 sentences about it in the paper, like it was about strangers. The journalist used the phrase, "alleged ring," and quoted Sloane's attorney as saying his client was shocked. And I wondered how many times a person can be shocked before the electricity in their life sets something on fire. Vince and Colleen have a way of riding the crest of every bad wave. It looked like money even then. The way they adjusted their faces for cameras, the way their words landed just outside of apology, the way they held themselves, the way you hold yourself when you do not believe anything has ever been your fault. On a day the sky decided to be blue for a change, I stood by the hospital window with a coffee that tasted like it had been made by someone who hates coffee and watched men in orange vests clear the snow from the top of the parking garage, one stripe at a time. Even from that far away, I knew which stripe was P3. I could see, if I squinted, the pillar where a person had handed another person an envelope and made it look like nothing. The air around my face warmed the glass just enough to fog it where I stood. I drew a tiny heart in the fog and then wiped it away, so only I knew it had been there. Caleb and I made a list on a yellow notepad. He wrote slow so his letters would behave, and he leaned forward with his tongue pressed to the corner of his mouth like he was learning to write his name in kindergarten again. We wrote down what we could control. Take the medications prescribed by the person who went to medical school. Drink water. Go to dialysis. Let people bring casseroles even if we could do without another sharp-edged lasagna in a foil pan. Thank the nurses by name. Pray out loud in the way that doesn't dare God to do magic, but invites him to sit down with you while you wait for the ordinary miracle of a lab value that inches the right way. We also wrote down what we couldn't control, not because we thought naming them would give us power, but because writing them down kept them from multiplying when the lights went off. What the police would do, what the investors would do, what the internet would say, what our friends would choose to believe about people they used to admire. I want to say a thing about forgiveness. People talk about it like a straight-ahead hallway. It is not. It is a haunted house and a corn maze and a church pew, and you find yourself walking back through places you swore you were done with. Some days, I loved Sloane still for the light I thought she had been. Some days, I shook with a hate that embarrassed me, and then I hated myself for hating. I started saying out loud, forgiveness is a direction, not a destination. My mouth learned it before my heart did. My heart eventually started to learn. On a Sunday afternoon, when the Lions were on television and the commentators were pretending they had been born with faith, Max asked if he could make a video with my phone for my channel. I didn't have a channel, but kids say things like that now the way we used to say, "Can I go outside?" He wanted to hold the phone himself, up too close to his face, so his eyebrows were part of the scenery. He began, "My name is Max, and I stopped my grandma's surgery." I laughed and took the phone back and said we would wait until I could write down what we wanted to say. Then we sat on the couch and ate chips we were not hungry for, and I thought about how often big triumphs look like small boys with cracked phones and breath that smells like ranch dust. The hospital's social worker told me to accept help and not to correct people when they said the wrong thing. Take casseroles, she said. Let the women with church hair pray over you, even if they smell like hairspray so strong you could shellac the porch with it. When a neighbor says, at least, you say thank you, and then you scream into a towel in your bathroom later. I didn't scream, but I did sing hymns too loud when I swept. Joy and rage are siblings. We made a plan. Me and Caleb and Max. Max would sleep at my place 2 nights a week so we could do homework without the hum of machines. He would be our reality check. Kids do that better than any adult I know. They don't let you make speeches. They ask if there are any cookies left. And you say no, and they say please, and you remember, yes, actually, there might be 1 or 2. And you sit and eat them, even though they're stale, and you both agree they taste like a memory, pretending to be current. At some point in your life, you will be asked a question by the universe that doesn't sound like a question until you hear yourself answering it. Mine in that bright room with my arm on a board and the light above me turning my face into a map was this: is your duty to your child the same as your duty to the truth? I have spent a lot of years choosing yes to one at the expense of the other, thinking that's what love was. Now I know it is both. A mother's duty is not just to show up for the surgery. It is to stop the surgery when what is being built isn't a life, but a ledger. People sent me messages from places I have never been. Arizona, where the desert makes people brave. Maine, where the cold is a kind of teacher. The Carolinas, where the sky opens up like a hand. A woman in Alaska who said the wind there could lift you off your porch and set you down 2 streets over if you weren't holding tight to the railing. They said, we see you. They said, we lost someone to a bottle bought on the internet that promised to fix what God had made too slow to heal. They said, we said yes to the wrong thing, and we wish someone had told us our yes wasn't a vow. I read every note because reading is my way of praying sometimes. I walked past the football field the week the snow melted enough that you could see the divots again. I stood by the chain link fence and listened to how empty a field sounds when it is not holding anybody's hope. Caleb Sr.'s, a kid who used to stiff-arm his own anxiety by sheer force of will, jogging by with his dog, lifted his hand and called across the street, "We need him back, Miss Pike." I called to the day, and what I meant was that the part of him that love built was going to show up to the life that had been waiting for him this whole time, even if his body took a while to catch up.
In the kitchen at home, I made a pot roast so big it looked like a dare. It made the house smell like being ate. Evan came over and stood at the stove and pretended he wasn't hungry until I put a pile of meat on a plate, and he ate it like he was in a contest. He said he had a new service call on P3 for a different part of the garage, and he didn't want to take it. "Then don't," I said. And he laughed and said he would, because he was a professional and because nothing good happens when you let fear be your union rep. He changed my furnace filter and told me that air gets mean when it sits too long in the same place, which is probably true for people too. I keep thinking about the words arc and milestone. I don't hate the words. Words are innocent until someone uses them like a screwdriver to loosen something that should be bolted down. I do hate that people get paid money by other people to ask their data to tell a story their lives are still living. I do hate that somewhere, someone has a spreadsheet with my son's blood in a cell shaped like a rectangle. If you're still listening, tell me where you are. Tell me what winter looks like where you live. Tell me if you ever almost said yes to something that would have cost you the part of yourself you need to keep. Real names and places in this telling have been changed or bent out of respect for people who never asked for a camera on their pain. But the bones of this story are exactly the bones. A light brighter than dignity. A boy who should have been at school running into a room no one allowed him to enter because he loved someone more than he loved the rules. A mother who signed and then unsigned with a word too small to describe what she did. Pause. A surgeon who listened when her patient said fear. A city that builds things relearning how to build trust.
I am still a person who believes in duty. The factory taught me that. So did love. But duty isn't a trick you play on yourself to avoid asking hard questions. Duty isn't a chain you put around your own ankle and call it loyalty. Duty is the hand you place on your own heart and say, I will tell the truth, even when the truth shows up with a cracked phone and eyes red from running down a hallway. Duty is what we owe to the living, including ourselves. The last night before Caleb came home for good, I sat beside his bed and watched the smallest parts of him as if they were proofs. The way his eyelids fluttered when he dreamed, the way his thumb tracked the edge of the blanket, the way his chest lifted and settled like a wave that had resigned itself to being an inland lake. He woke and saw me watching him and smiled like we were both kids caught looking at the stars out the back window of the car on the ride home from a place you didn't want to leave. Mom, I don't know how to describe it. You don't have to. You just have to live it. On my porch now, the light doesn't buzz. The snow on the railing turns into water and runs off to a place that remembers what to do with it. I keep the picture Max drew taped to my refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a cherry. His cape flares out behind me in heroic disobedience to gravity. His phone is forever cracked. We will frame it when money is less of a bully. For now, I let it live on the fridge with grocery lists and greasy fingers because that's what real life looks like. Holy next to ordinary. Courage next to milk. If I were the kind to end with a moral, I would say this. Blood doesn't always make you family, and family isn't always blood. But the truth always tells you who your people are. If I were the kind to end with a prayer, I would say, God bless the ones who run into rooms they're not supposed to enter. God bless the ones who stop a machine because a person is worth more than a graph. God bless the ones who pause. God bless the ones who listen when a 10-year-old says, wait. If I were the kind to ask you for something, I would say, like, subscribe, and tell me where you are listening from. Not for me. For the next person who believes that duty means they don't get to ask a question. For the next person lying under a light that shows them every line on their face and everything in that face that says they are still alive and can choose. Tell me where you are, so we can draw a line from here to there and call it what it is. A way for light to travel. And if you tell me one more thing, tell me this. What would you have done? Would you have kept the peace if the peace asked for your son's life as a receipt? Or would you have done what my grandson did for me? Chosen courage at an age when courage should be mostly about asking for another story before bedtime? I will wait in the comments. I will read every word. I will tell you what a friend told me when I thought my heart was going to give out from trying to beat and break at the same time. Courage isn't loud. It's just the next right breath. And then the one after that. And then the one after that.